Hello world, Lisa Friedrichsen, your friend and computer science professor with another short screencast about JavaScript. This is the last in our Functions 101 series. We've gone through the why we create functions in the first place, what they look like, when they run, where to put them in your code, and now we're on how do functions operate. And we've touched upon some of these topics before, but specifically I'm going to drill down into function parameters and arguments, composing functions, and return values of functions. I believe this series really cuts to the heart of what we mean by functional programming. To demonstrate those concepts of functions, I'm going to use this little web page I created. It has some input boxes for your name and your score. And right now, my JavaScript app has only two functions. One function runs when I click the average scores button, and another function runs when I click add new score. So if I get scores of 100 and 90 and I click the average scores button, then this function average score is going to run because I've used the add event listener method on the average scores button. That's the ID of this button. When clicked, it's going to run this avg score, this function. This button, add new score, sends new labels and input boxes to the web page so that I can keep recording my scores. But as you can see, as I keep recording my scores, my average score is not updating. We're going to use these two functions and compose them so that as I click add new score, my average is always being updated as well. I don't have to go back and make sure that I've clicked the average scores button. So to unpack how this is working, let's look at this average score function that's running when I click this average scores button. I've assigned a variable named scores, and I've assigned it to query selector all method .score. That goes after anything that has a class HTML attribute value of score. And the things that have an HTML class attribute of score are these two input boxes. Let's try that again. Let's give ourselves a 100 and a 90. Then we're going to console log out what that is to make sure that we're grabbing what we think we're grabbing. Let me click the average scores button, which triggers this avg score function. And yes, on line 5 of my JavaScript, I'm getting this console log. So it's console logging out scores, and we see it's a node list of two things. And as I hover over those two things, we can see what they are in the HTML above. If I open them up, I can see all the properties. The property that I'm, of course, most interested in with an input box is often their value. And we can see that that value is a string. Any number in an input box is going to come into the JavaScript environment as a string, even though in the HTML we've typed that input box as type number. Type number is great, though. It's very necessary because it prevents us from able to type non-numeric characters into the input box, and it also gives us this handy-dandy spinner control, which is really kind of nice for numbers. So in our next statement in our JavaScript, I'm declaring another variable named sum, and I'm assigning that to 0. And then the magic happens. Then I'm going against that scores node list. Refresh and do this one more time. I'm using that node list that I created of these two input boxes, and I'm using the forEach method. And we know a method when we see it because we see the parentheses. Just like a function, a method must have the parentheses in order for it to execute. In fact, methods are just built-in functions that are already available for us to use. The forEach method is one of my favorites. We use it to apply the same code to every item in an array or in a node list. So it's a very common method. And if you can understand the forEach method, you really get a good grasp on functional programming. Because what is the one argument that we pass into the forEach method? Well, the one argument right here inside the parentheses, I don't see any commas separating multiple values. I see one value being passed into the forEach method, and that value is a function. So we can pass in functions as arguments, other functions and methods. Sometimes that's referred to as first-class functions or functional programming, but it's definitely a big part of JavaScript. And so what the forEach method does is it takes one function as its argument, and then it applies that function to each member of the node list. When I define my function, what I want to have happen, each item in the scores node list, I have to declare one variable, one parameter in the function, and as I go through my node list or my array, that becomes each member as this function is being applied to each member. Sometimes that's called a callback function because this function is being called back for each item in the node list or each item in the array if we use the forEach method against an array. It's beautifully named. This function is going to run for each item in the node list. And each item in the node list, your temporary name, I've declared you as SC. And what we're going to do to each item in the array is we're going to take the sum, which starts out as 0, and we're going to add it to the SC's value. Well, each item in the array has a value. The value for the first item in the node list is 99. The value property for the second item in the node list is 90. And that's why I have this little extra plus sign there. Convert that string 99 and that string 90 to a number. I'm picking up its value property, which is right here. So this SC is just a temporary variable name. I can call it S. Now if I call it S for score, I have to use that same variable name, obviously in my statements in my function. Oftentimes we call it a singular value of whatever our list is. And that makes a ton of sense. So for each score, we're going to add it to the previous sum. I put this for loop here just so you can compare and contrast the forEach method to a for loop, because that's really what a forEach method is. It's a safer way to loop through values of an array or to loop through the values of a node list, because I don't have to initiate a counter, I don't have to test a counter, and I don't have to increment a counter as I do in a for loop. And I've got a whole YouTube just on forEach method because it's so important. What I'm trying to get across here is that a function can be passed in as a value to another function or method. It also demonstrates the use of creating a parameter variable when you define the function. It's used in the statements of the function. And it also demonstrates what a callback function is, in that this function is called back against each item, each score in the scores node list. My last statement on line 13 is just document get element by ID average, and that's this little paragraph here. I'm changing its text content property and assigning it to sum, the addition of these two numbers, divided by the length of the node list, which in this case is 2, and then I'm making sure that it rounds to 2 digits to the right of the decimal point. I'm going to save this. I'm going to refresh my page. I want to run this one more time. And this time I'm going to run it here in the console instead of clicking my average scores button, AVG score. And when I run it from the console, what I want you to notice is not only do I get the console log of what scores contains from line 5 in the console, but I also get this undefined. If you do not have an explicit return statement on a function, the function returns undefined. And that's fine, because sometimes you don't need the function to return anything. If I uncomment this line 16 and I return that value, watch what happens to my console now when I run the average score function in the console. It's returning that calculation. And that can be very helpful when we compose functions, because what we want to do when we add a new score is that we want those numbers to be averaged in. So I'm going to take this average score function, and here's my new score function. I'm going to go ahead and add a new statement that takes this average paragraph and assigns it to the average score function. So it's going to run the average score function at that point in time. Now the average score function does not have any parameters. I don't need to pass in any arguments here to the function. But look at it, it's going to run. So when my new score button now runs, it's going to go ahead and recalculate this average score function immediately. And because I've got a return statement here, this is going to become the actual average score. Save and refresh and see how this looks. 190. When I click the add new score, see how I'm getting my average? I'm going to put in a 0, which is going to really change my average down to 63. Every time now that I'm clicking my add new score button, my average is being recalculated. And the reason I can do that is because I can assign this text content property of this paragraph to a function. And I'm going to run the function. And when I run this function, something is returned. And so this assignment becomes what is returned from from the average score function after it runs. It's an important part of composing your functions. Thank you.